They said the house wasn't mine. Imagine standing on your own porch, key in hand, briefcase still warm from a long day at the office, and being told you were trespassing. The absurdity was so sharp it almost felt comedic, but the laughter never came. It was replaced by flashing blue lights, hands on holsters, and the sharp edge of suspicion that had followed me since boyhood. I had just returned from a day in Washington that should have been the beginning of a new chapter. The president himself had sworn me in as the nation's attorney general, a moment I had envisioned since law school, when long nights of study and relentless ambition pushed me through every barrier designed to keep me out. Yet here I was, standing on the steps of my own home, being asked for proof that I belonged. Proof. As if my skin color was already a crime scene. The neighborhood was quiet, the golden hour painting my lawn in honey light. Children's laughter drifted faintly from down the street, but it was drowned out by the static of police radios and the stern voices of men who had already judged me guilty. The first officer, stocky and red-faced, barked at me to put my hands where he could see them. His partner's hand hovered near his weapon, not out of necessity, but out of habit, the reflex that always surfaced when they faced someone who looked like me. I told them calmly that this was my home, that I had keys, that the car in the driveway was mine. My voice was steady, though inside me a storm churned, a familiar storm, born from decades of living under the suspicion of being black in America. Still, I forced myself to stay composed, because one wrong word, one sudden movement, and my story could end on this very doorstep. The taller officer sneered. "You expect us to believe that?" His eyes slid over me, not seeing the suit, not seeing the credentials, not seeing the man. Just the skin. Just the story he had already written about me before I even opened my mouth. My fingers tightened around my briefcase, but I let it drop slowly to the ground. "I don't expect you to believe anything," I said. "I expect you to do your job and check before you throw a man in handcuffs on his own property." But reason rarely stands a chance against prejudice. One officer moved behind me, the cold steel of handcuffs grazing my wrist before I even finished my sentence. The metallic click echoed in the still air, and with it came a memory the first time I'd ever been cuffed, at 16, walking home from basketball practice because I fit the description. Decades later, nothing had changed. As they pushed me toward their squad car, a neighbor stepped out onto her porch, her mouth open in shock. She knew me. She waved to me every morning when I left for work. She had baked cookies for my daughter's birthday. Her voice shook as she called out, "That's his house. He lives there." The officers ignored her. Their world had no room for witnesses unless they fit the narrative. My jaw clenched, and I felt a bitter irony settle in my chest. Hours ago, I was shaking the hand of the President of the United States, taking an oath to uphold justice. Now, I was being shoved into the back of a cruiser, treated as if I had no right to even exist on my own street. Inside the car, I stared out the window, watching the sunset smear gold across the sky. The light was beautiful, almost mocking in its serenity, while inside I simmered with rage, humiliation, and a strange, quiet sadness. I thought of my father, who had always warned me, "Son, no matter how high you climb, some people will only see your skin." I used to think my achievements would prove him wrong. Tonight, his words felt carved into stone. The officers drove in silence, their posture rigid, their faces set in grim satisfaction as though they had performed some heroic act. I wondered what story they would tell their colleagues how they had caught a suspicious black male breaking into a suburban home. A story they had rehearsed countless times, one the system would nod along to, one that would erase me if not for the truth I carried. But the truth was heavy. It was bigger than me, bigger than this moment. It was the weight of an entire history of men and women who had been silenced, shackled, erased. And here I was, their descendant, wearing the chains of injustice once more, even as I held the nation's highest legal office. What they didn't know was that their arrogance had set the stage for a reckoning. Not just for me, but for them, for the city, for a country still stumbling toward the promise it made centuries ago. My arrest would not be hidden. My humiliation would not be swept under the rug. They thought they had arrested a man. Instead, they had arrested the law itself. The car rolled to a stop outside the precinct, its walls glowing orange in the fading light. The door opened, and rough hands pulled me out, guiding me toward a place where countless others like me had been swallowed by the system. But as I stepped into the shadows of that building, I carried with me a fire they had no idea they had just ignited. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. The station smelled of stale coffee and bleach, the kind of place where dignity came to die. The officers escorted me past desks cluttered with half-eaten donuts and paperwork, past other black men who sat slumped in chairs with the same defeated expression I refused to wear. Eyes followed me, some curious, some indifferent, none surprised. This was routine here. Another black man in cuffs. Nothing new. They sat me down hard in a chair, metal scraping against the floor. One officer filled out forms while the other leaned against the wall, smirking like he had already won. Name, he asked without looking at me. I considered giving it. Then I considered silence. Both options seemed like surrender. Instead, I said, before I answer anything, I want my lawyer. That earned a chuckle. Sure you do. They all say that. They didn't know I was the lawyer. More than that, I was now the head of the Department of Justice, the top lawyer in the land. But revealing that truth too soon would rob me of something important. I wanted them to show the world exactly who they were before I showed them who I was. So I sat, calm, watching them scribble lies on their forms. Suspicious activity. Possible break-in. Resisting instructions. They wrote a narrative I had seen written 1,000 times. A narrative where the black man was always dangerous, always guilty, always wrong. An hour passed. Then 2. They left me in a holding cell with 3 other men. One, an older black man with weary eyes, nodded at me knowingly. What they get you for, he asked. For going home, I said. He barked out a bitter laugh. Ain't that the truth? I was standing outside a store waiting for my nephew. They said I was casing the place. The others joined in, each with a story of absurdity that wasn't absurd at all, just ordinary in America. I listened, my anger simmering lower, transforming into something sharper, something that would cut. After hours of waiting, a sergeant arrived. He was older, grayer, with a gut that pressed against his uniform. He looked at me, then at the paperwork, then back at me. Something flickered across his face, a hesitation, a doubt. What's your name again? I told him this time, slowly, clearly. His pen froze. The room seemed to still. He looked at me harder, as if trying to reconcile the name he knew from the news with the man in cuffs before him. His lips parted, but no sound came out. He turned abruptly and left the room. Minutes later, chaos erupted. The officers who had arrested me stormed in, their confidence gone, replaced by panic. Siru didn't know, one stammered. The other fumbled with the keys, nearly dropping them as he unlocked the cuffs. Their hands shook, their faces drained of color. I rubbed my wrists slowly, deliberately. The red marks from the metal cuffs glowed against my skin, evidence of the truth they couldn't erase. You didn't know? I repeated, my voice calm but deadly sharp. That's the problem. They begged, stumbling over apologies, claiming misunderstanding, insisting they were only doing their jobs. Their words meant nothing. Their fear wasn't for what they had done to Might, was for what would happen to them once the world found out. I stood, straightening my suit jacket. The room seemed to shrink around me. You will hear from me again, I said. Not loud, not angry, just final. By the time I walked out of that precinct, cameras were already there. News travels fast in the capital, faster still when whispers reach journalists hungry for scandal. The flashing lights that had humiliated me earlier now illuminated my face as I stood on the steps, free but far from finished. Reporters shouted questions, microphones shoved toward me like weapons. Is it true you were arrested outside your own home? How do you respond to the allegations? What does this mean for your role as Attorney General? I looked out at the sea of cameras, at the crowd of ordinary people gathering behind them, their faces a mixture of rage, curiosity, and hope. For years, I had dreamed of moments like this, moments when I could speak truth to the nation. I had imagined courtrooms, press conferences, speeches before Congress. I never imagined it would happen on the steps of a police station, my wrists still burning from cuffs. I cleared my throat, let the silence settle, then spoke. Tonight, I was arrested for the crime of entering my own home. I was arrested not because of what I did, but because of what I am. A black man. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The cameras clicked furiously. The officers who placed me in handcuffs did not ask questions. They did not listen. They did not see a man in a suit with keys in his hand. They saw only skin, and that was enough for them to decide I was a suspect. But they did not know who I was. They did not know that earlier today, I was sworn in as Attorney General of the United States. The reporters erupted, voices overlapping in a storm of questions. But I raised my hand, and silence fell again. This is not about me, I continued. This is about every man, every woman, every child who has been judged guilty before being given a chance to be seen. This is about a system that believes blackness itself is suspicion. And I promise you this, as long as I hold this office, we will confront that system. We will not hide from it. We will not excuse it. We will change it. The crowd roared. Some cheered, some cried, some simply stood frozen, as if they had witnessed history shift by a fraction in front of them. Behind me, I knew the officers were watching. I didn't look back. Their fear was not my concern anymore. My concern was justice, not revenge. But justice would come, swift and unrelenting, not just for them, but for everything they represented. That night, I returned home at last. The house stood silent, bathed again in the golden glow of porch lights. I unlocked the door, the simple act feeling like defiance, like reclaiming something that had been stolen. Inside, my daughter ran to me, her small arms wrapping around my waist. Her innocence shielded her from what had happened, but I knew it wouldn't forever. One day, she would face her own storm. And when that day came, I wanted her to live in a country where the color of her skin did not write her story before she could hold the pen. As I tucked her into bed, I promised her quietly, "Daddy's going to fix this." The promise wasn't just for her. It was for all of us. The morning after the arrest, my phone would not stop ringing. Messages flooded in from colleagues, journalists, politicians, and old friends I hadn't spoken to in years. Some offered sympathy, others demanded statements, and a few urged me to stay quiet, to let the storm pass. But silence had never saved us before. Silence was the oxygen racism breathed. I sat at my kitchen table, the smell of fresh coffee rising in the air, though I hadn't touched my cup. My wife, Angela, stood across from me, her eyes fierce even through exhaustion. She had stayed awake all night, pacing, replaying the images of me being led away in handcuffs on our own lawn. "You can't just let this go," she said. Her voice trembled, but her words were iron. "If they can do this to you, what chance does anyone else have?" I nodded. I didn't need convincing. My entire life had been preparing me for this fight. Law school, courtrooms, the battles I fought for civil rights cases that never made headlines, all of it was fuel. But now, as Attorney General, the fire I carried could blaze across the nation. By mid-morning, I was in my office at the Justice Department. The walls were still bare, boxes unpacked, the air smelling of fresh paint. Yet the weight of the office pressed on me, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. My staff, still adjusting to the reality of working for me, looked at me differently now. Not just as their boss, but as a symbol of a system cracking open. One of my deputies, a sharp young woman named Elena, closed the door behind her as she entered. "Sir," the president called. "He's standing behind you 100%. But he also warned that the police union is already preparing a defense. They're saying this was a simple misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. The words burn like acid. "A misunderstanding doesn't put handcuffs on a man's wrists," I said quietly. "A misunderstanding doesn't write false charges on intake forms." Elena nodded, her jaw tight. "I know. And people know. The footage is everywhere. Neighbors filmed it. The press has run it nonstop. America saw what happened. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment. The answer was both simple and impossible. "We go to war," I said. "Not a war of guns or violence, but a war of truth, law, and relentless accountability. A war against the quiet, everyday bigotry that hid behind badges, policies, and excuses." The next days blurred into one another: press conferences, strategy meetings, interviews. I stood in front of Congress and demanded sweeping reforms to policing. I met with activists who had marched for years, their voices hoarse from shouting into deaf ears. I spoke with mothers who held photographs of sons who would never come home. Every story poured gasoline on the fire in my chest. The police union fought back hard. They painted me as biased, as someone with a personal vendetta against law enforcement. They dug into my past, looking for cracks. Commentators on certain networks sneered, calling me angry and dangerous. I let them talk. Their noise only revealed their fear. What they didn't expect was the tide turning. My arrest had struck a nerve. People who had stayed silent before now spoke. White neighbors who had witnessed the arrest gave interviews, their outrage piercing through indifference. Business leaders, clergy, teachers all began to say the same thing. Enough. One evening, I returned home late, exhaustion dragging at my bones. My daughter was waiting on the couch, holding a drawing she had made at school. It showed me, standing tall, with a golden light around me. Beside me was her, holding my hand. Above us, she had written in shaky letters, "My daddy makes justice." I nearly broke. Children should not have to see their fathers humiliated to learn what justice means. Yet in her innocent eyes, I wasn't a victim. I was a fighter. And that meant I had no choice but to keep going. The turning point came 2 weeks later, when I was summoned to testify before a congressional committee. The chamber was packed, cameras everywhere, the weight of history pressing on every wooden bench. My critics were ready to pounce, to twist the story, to call me unfit for office. I began with no notes, no script, just truth. 2 weeks ago, I was arrested outside my own home. Not because I broke the law, not because there was evidence of a crime, but because, to those officers, my black skin was crime enough. This is not an isolated incident. This is America's reflection in the mirror. The room fell silent. I could feel the cameras feeding my words to millions beyond those walls. We tell ourselves this nation is built on justice. But justice cannot live where suspicion replaces evidence, where prejudice replaces law. I am not here today as a victim. I am here as the Attorney General. And I will not rest until the justice system that betrayed me and has betrayed so many others is rebuilt into one that protects us all equally. Some members shifted uncomfortably, others nodded. A few clapped, though protocol demanded silence. The message had landed. That night, the country erupted again. Some called me a hero, others called me a traitor. But what mattered most was that people were no longer ignoring the truth. The story of my arrest was no longer just my story. It was America's story. Still, the officers who arrested me remained unrepentant. Their statements to the press dripped with arrogance, insisting they had acted properly. But the investigation I had launched was thorough. Their lies unraveled, piece by piece, until even their allies couldn't deny it. When the day of their hearing came, I attended not as the Attorney General presiding over justice, but as a man who had lived the humiliation they inflicted. I sat quietly in the back as the evidence was read aloud, every falsehood exposed, every prejudice laid bare. The officers sat pale and rigid, stripped of the power they once wielded so carelessly. Justice, for once, tilted toward the truth. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters asked me what I felt seeing them held accountable. I paused, then said, "This isn't about two men. This is about a culture. Accountability cannot stop with them. It has to reach every corner of our system." The golden hour light bathed the courthouse steps, just as it had bathed my porch the night of my arrest. And for the first time, I felt that light not as mockery, but as a promise. The fight was far from over. But we had taken the first step. The weeks stretched into months, and with each passing day the story refused to fade. What began as a humiliating night on my own doorstep had ignited something larger than me, larger than Washington politics, larger than law itself. It had sparked a movement. And I knew movements are fragile. They either grow into revolutions or collapse under the weight of resistance. The police unions dug in their heels. Conservative commentators accused me of staging my own arrest for political gain, as if I had orchestrated the humiliation, the cold cuffs, the hours in a cell. I let them rant. Their voices were the sound of an old guard clinging to a crumbling world. But on the streets, in the neighborhoods that had suffered longest, hope grew louder than cynicism. Churches held vigils, students organized marches, communities that had been divided by fear found themselves united in anger and in resolve. They carried signs with my name, yes, but more often they carried signs with the names of people whose stories had ended in tragedy, whose names deserved to echo as long as this country stood. Inside the Justice Department, we began drafting reforms, stricter accountability for officers, independent oversight boards, new training that was more than empty seminars. I demanded body cameras not as a shield for police, but as a shield for the people. I called for demilitarization, for community policing, for a culture that saw citizens not as threats, but as human beings. The resistance was fierce. Politicians who had grown fat off the support of police unions fought us tooth and nail. State governors thundered against federal overreach. Some even accused me of hating law enforcement. But I reminded them, every chance I got, justice is not anti-police. Justice is pro-truth. And truth does not fear accountability. One night, after another brutal day of hearings and speeches, I stood alone in my office. The city lights shimmered through the window, casting long reflections on the polished floor. I thought of my father again, of the nights he worked double shifts just to keep food on the table, of the lessons he taught me about dignity and survival. He had once told me, "Son, you can bend the law to serve men, or you can raise it to serve humanity, but you can't do both." Now, in this office, I finally understood the depth of his words. The true climax came on a cold December morning. Congress had called a special session to vote on the most sweeping police reform bill in half a century. The nation was watching, the air thick with anticipation. I was invited to speak before the vote. I walked into the chamber, the sound of whispers rolling like waves. Faces turned some hostile, some curious, some hopeful. I carried no papers, no notes. Just the truth etched into my memory. "I stand before you not as a politician," I began, "not as a man with a title, but as a citizen who once stood in handcuffs for the crime of existing in his own skin." Two officers saw me not as a homeowner, not as a father, not as a professional, but as a suspect. And in that moment, they saw not just me, but every black man this nation has ever judged guilty without cause. The chamber was silent, every ear bent toward my voice. I was fortunate. My name, my title, my position, these things saved me. But most are not so lucky. Their names are carved into gravestones, their stories buried with them. We cannot claim to be a land of liberty if justice bends only for some and breaks against others. Today, you have a choice. Not between left or right, not between police and citizens, but between justice and injustice. And history will remember what you chose. When I finished, I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, applause began to spread, first a handful of members, then dozens, then the entire gallery above, filled with citizens who had come to watch. It was not unanimous, but it was undeniable. Hours later, the bill passed. Narrowly, but it passed. For the first time in decades, the machinery of justice had shifted, if only by an inch. But in that inch, the weight of centuries had begun to move. That night, I walked home instead of taking a car. I wanted to feel the city, to breathe its air without a windshield between me and the people I served. As I approached my house, the porch lights glowed gold, just as they had the night of my arrest. But this time, there were no flashing police lights, no accusations, no humiliation. Just home. My daughter was waiting on the steps, bundled in her coat, her small face breaking into a grin when she saw me. "Daddy," she said, running into my arms. "Did you fix it?" Her question cut straight to my soul. I wanted to tell her yes, that everything was fixed, that racism was dead, that justice was finally whole. But I knew better. I knelt down so my eyes met hers. "I started fixing it," I said softly. "And I'll keep fixing it. For you. For everyone." She smiled, content with that answer, and in her innocence I found my strength renewed. As the two of us went inside, I glanced once more at the golden glow around our home. It was no longer just light. It was a symbol, a reminder that even in the darkest hours, justice could find its way through the cracks, illuminating what had been hidden, demanding to be seen. I knew the fight was far from over. There would be setbacks, betrayals, backlash, but there would also be progress. And as long as I drew breath, I would keep pushing, keep fighting, keep bending the arc of this nation closer to justice. Because in the end, this was never just my story. It was America's. And for the first time, I truly believe that America was ready to listen. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.